The barbarism employed by Great Britain, Spain, Portugal, and other European nations to subjugate Amerindian peoples during colonial times and by the countries they begot in the Americas as a result of colonizations probably exceeds or at the very minimum equals the barbaric performance of the 20th century's regimes of Nazi Germany and the Stalinist Soviet Union combined. Like the people who suffered horribly under those regimes, Amerindians at various times and places over the past 500 years were imprisoned and executed without trial or recourse, enslaved, tortured, relocated without consent, treated as inferior human beings, subjected to deliberate genocide, and demonized by monstrous lies. Children were removed from families, properties were confiscated by the state without compensation, cultures were destroyed, and so on.
This book, We Were Not the Savages, Ce n'était pas nous les sauvages, is your lifelong work in a way. Can you tell me why you wrote it and how that came about?
Well, I can go way back, and what really started me on it was I was working in Boston, probably around 17, 18 at the time, and I worked in this hat factory, and there was a black lady from either Louisiana or Mississippi, I don't quite remember which state, and she was a very huge lady, let's put it that way, and her and I used to get in some talk and conversation, and one day she called me over and she says, "Boy," she just says, "you walk around here, with your head down and like you think everybody's better than you." And got me thinking, okay, and she said, "What do you know about your people?" And I said, "Very little." I said, "Really not too much." And she said, "Someday when you go home, says find out what your people, the history of your people." And she said, "Maybe you'll be very proud." And that's what I did. But it even goes back further than that. But really, got me going was when probably I was around 4 or 5 years old. And my mother and I went to the Indian agent, and we hadn't had anything to eat for about 3 or 4 days. And he made her beg for 4 hours before he finally gave what was called a ration. And I can remember at that young age saying, when I grow up, no bastard like you is going to do that to me. So those two items put together is the things that got me wanting to find out about the history of our people. Well, actually, after I had that conversation with the lady in Boston, and I think it was 1960, my brother was getting married up in Truro and wanted me to come home to be best man at his wedding, and I did. And on my way back to Boston, we were driving in on the Greyhound, and I was looking out the window, and I said to myself, "What the hell are you doing here?" And I went to this terminal, and I bought a return ticket in Nova Scotia. I came back, and decided I should go to business college, and went and applied in Truro, and that was 1961, and I was accepted. I only had a part of grade 9. Wasn't a high school graduate. And I went to the Indian agent to ask for funding, and he told me I should get a pick and shovel and do what I was best suited for. I never wanted to take that kind of answer. I went to my Aunt Becky, who had worked for Cyril, I can't think of his last name at the moment, and asked him for assistance. He was the MP for that area. And he obliged, and he got in touch with the Minister of Indian Affairs, who in turn called the Indian agent, and before the day was over, I had my funding. And the thing with that, the whole thing was insulting in the sense that, they publicized that they were there to help us. But when it came time to help, they were very interested in not helping us. So in from there, I came out as the top of the whole class. As a matter of fact, I finished the bookkeeping and advanced bookkeeping and cost accounting in 3 months, and I have an aptitude for that kind of thing. So all this was not really building up to writing a book, but I did start writing newspaper columns.
The title to this book is very, very strong, and really I think carried a lot of weight. In French, ce n'était pas nous les sauvages, we were not the savages. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to you?
I believe there's been a false perception that's been around for a long time that intellectually we're stunted. The Mi'kmaq were people that were most welcoming, okay, and you can go out to the Acadian community and you will find probably 80 or 90% have some Mi'kmaq blood in them or indigenous blood in them. And the reason for it is that they got along quite well with the Mi'kmaq. Again, I'm separating the two from the French government to the people themselves. And they treated the Mi'kmaq with respect and what have you. And then the English were just the opposite. Okay, they came in and they were white supremacists to the core, and the savages, which they branded them, the people were, uncouth or whatever you want to talk about. And one of the biggest laughs I got while I was putting together the research for the book was simply that often the missionaries, the French missionaries themselves, would wonder out loud, how come these savages are acting more civilized than we? Okay, and that is something that, and I also knew about slavery and the fact that they were still burning people at the stake, and the British, I think, finally abolished it in 1778, I believe, that kind of barbarity, the key hauling and all the rest of this grand, civilized actions. So our people weren't doing that kind of barbarity. And so therefore, who was civilized and who was not, and who were the savages, okay? And that in a nutshell is what it was. Our people didn't go looking for torturing people or anything like that. And when you're looking at the opposite side, that was just the big difference, okay? Even their own people, I have it in there where, they forbid any interchanges between the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians at one time after they took over. And I think it was Robichaud, I believe, my memory is a little rusty here, but he was imprisoned because he had invited the Mi'kmaq chief in to have a cup of tea, I guess, with him or something. That kind of civilization, that's not civilization, that's barbarity, okay? When you can sit back and watch people going hungry in your community without lifting a finger to do anything about it. So that's where the we were not the savages.
At first, the idea was to maybe say, nous n'étions pas les sauvages. We were not the savages, which is maybe a bit closer word for word to the English title. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, my understanding was that in English, it's stronger than just saying, we are not. It was also saying, perhaps you were, So.
Well, that's the implication, okay? The title is, we were not, so who else could be the savage but you? So it's a title that I really think was very appropriate. I have no apologies to make for being very opinionated in the book, because I was angry when I was writing the book, okay? All this information was available for centuries, and it's never been published. And the thing that really shocked me after the first edition was published in 1993, I got a call from a lady who was Dean of Law, and I won't mention it because, you know, I have no record of it, but other than verbal. And she called me up and she says, first when I'm going to talk to you, I want to talk about my education. She says, I have a PhD in law and another one in English, and, you know, and then she rattled off all her other education achievements. And then she said, I never knew a thing about scalp proclamations until I read your book. Okay? And that was what it's all about. It was, all this information was readily available at the archives at any given time, but Caucasian, in particular Anglo historians, decided they didn't want to publicize it. And I can understand why they didn't, because that's, you know, led to the title of the book. We were not the savages. Okay.
You just said that you were angry when you were writing the book. Are you still angry?
Not really, because the society is beginning to change quite drastically. I think I had a lot to do with it. And telling the story as it transpired, and seeing people begin to change their attitudes. And, you know, when I first came to Halifax in 1961, for instance, Jews and Muslims were not allowed in English, Anglo boat clubs and stuff like that. They were still barred from things like that. You had to educate, and it takes a long time. I always remember when I started the disturbance, and there were newspaper stories about We Were Not the Savages, first edition coming out, and I ran into an Anglo gentleman out in Bedford in the Sunnyside Mall, and he came up to me and he said, "You creature, you." And he says, "How dare you defile the sainted memories of my sainted ancestors?" And I burst out laughing, to tell you the truth. And I said, "You don't know anything about your ancestors." And I said, "Here's my card. When the book comes out," I said, "you read it, and then give me a call and we'll have a discussion." He's a damn slow reader. I haven't heard from him yet. And there's 35 years.
You did rework the second and third edition, I think, or at least the second.
Had some people come up to me and say, "Well, provide the proof." And I had a look at the references in the back and discovered that, you know, maybe a lot of the proof that was needed wasn't there. So I went and I got the proof and I put it in, and so I think it's on the second page of the book where I simply state, this is your history. Okay, this is your archives, not mine. If I had wrote the book from, say, from so-called oral history, then you people would come along and say it's bullshit. So you go down to the archives and you can find everything I have to say in this book. It's the hidden history, okay, of the Americas. You look at what happened in Nazi Germany was a horrible crime against humanity. But how about the crime against humanity that happened in North and South America, where you had entire civilizations, in some instances, completely terminated, exterminated, and all the rest of them reduced to stages of poverty that was unbelievable, and reduced to being beggars in their own home. And so this story had to be told, and I decided to put it together. And initially, actually, I was going to write it about the Americas, and then I decided it would be too big.
Yeah.
You couldn't manage it, so I had to settle on my own people.
And do you feel that the book is still needed?
Definitely, and we should all be learning about the history as it transpired in this area. And, you know, again, you wouldn't have this young Acadian man outside of Burn Church on a lobster fishing boat shouting at the Mi'kmaq saying, "My ancestors should have finished what you were doing." because both of the ancestors had, been left alone to continue what they were doing, they probably would have built a fairly decent nation in this area. Would have been a mixture of Mi'kmaq and Acadian. Actually, I find Acadians, and they probably don't know this, but they do have adopted many of the customs. And when I got my honorary degree from St. Anne's University, the feast, the dinner afterwards, I got a big kick out of it because the senators and the millionaires and the farmers and the fishermen and everybody else were all chatting. There was no head table, and that's Mi'kmaq culture. Okay, you might have been chief, but you were a chief among equal among equals, okay? And I got a kick out of the research I was doing because more than once I ran across where the French government was beginning to look at the people that evolved into being Acadians and Quebecers with kind of, how would you say, disdain, because they were no longer considered the, good French subjects. They were too...
They were very independent.
Yeah, they were corrupted by the democratic notions of the indigenous people that they were cohabiting with.
You're saying the book changed a lot of things. We know that, I think, in the Maritime provinces. Cornwallis statue coming down, I've heard some people say, well, Dan Paul's book was really kind of the match that lit. It took, 20 years. It's a huge legacy, in fact, that you have there. But is there something you would do differently, or things that you'd like to review, or go further, or retract, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Not a thing. No, really, it's. I think it accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. Let's put it that way. I don't really think you'd ever go back to the point where you're going to, have the Mi'kmaq viewed as savages or,
lesser people.
Yeah.